Mr. Tunick, thank you to receive us today at TEFAF. We were quite impressed when we met the selection of BIAPAL picks about the numbers of Rembrandt prints that you have. I mean, quality Rembrandt prints. Are you a specialist about Rembrandt or something like this?
Well, I've always loved Rembrandt, and when I started, I worked very early at the Metropolitan Museum. I was kind of a fellow, and my assignment the first year was Albrecht Dürer, the engravings of Dürer, and the second year was the etchings of Rembrandt. So I concentrated an entire year on Rembrandt, and that was, what, 46, 47 years ago. And I've been concentrating on Rembrandt ever since. So I know a little bit about Rembrandt.
Yeah, so what we can see in your stand is that you mix old master prints with modern prints. I wanted to ask you something about this particular one. What can you tell us about this particular Rembrandt?
Well, first I'd like to say that we mix old master and modern because, to me, the great painters, many of the great painters made prints. And so that's something that I've tried to tell clients and students from the time I started almost 50 years ago, that for the great painters, printmaking was as important as painting was for Goya, for Picasso, for Rembrandt, for Dürer, for Degas. And I think it's very important for people to understand that prints are not a poor relation, not a poor second cousin. And that's an exhibition still waiting to be done, everything that Picasso did in a particular week, and people will understand the relationships that existed between prints, drawings, paintings, and sculpture, that the great artists like Rembrandt went back and forth, and there were many things going on among these different media, so that printmaking for Rembrandt was just as important as painting. And to answer your question, this particular print, one of my favorite portraits by Rembrandt, is an image of his close friend Abraham Francen, he was a druggist, he was an apothecary, and on what must have been a very slim kind of salary, wages, he was a collector. And in the print, he is surrounded by things that he collected. Now, Rembrandt himself was a great student of art history, and he knew that in Renaissance portraiture, his subjects were surrounded by objects that stood for whatever they did, what their professions were, what they stood for in life. And that's what he's done here in the portrait of Francen, which, by the way, is the only horizontal portrait that Rembrandt ever made. So this shows Francen seated in a chair, bathed in a golden kind of sunlight, and behind him is an old master painting, what would have been an old master painting in the time, a Renaissance triptych, a crucifixion, we can plainly see that. In the background, a contemporary painting. He collected contemporary paintings, and that's a 17th century landscape. We can just about make it out. On the table is an Asian, a Taoist deity that would have come in from the Orient. Also on the table next to the Taoist deity is a skull. Maybe that's a symbol of his being a chemist. Also at the time, people collected natural history, they collected shells, they collected crystals. And on the table, most interesting of all to me as a dealer in works of art on paper, is an album. And Francen is holding in his hand a printer drawing. On the verso side of it, on the back of it, you can see a portrait of someone, we don't know who. He's looking at one side of it, and he clearly is going to be putting it into the album. And the album shows one sheet that is folded out. It would have been folded into the album when the album was closed. And in fact, that's how collectors preserve these wonderful Rembrandts, Dürers, other old master prints. It's why they come down to us in such good condition, because they were preserved in albums that these collectors kept on shelves in their library. Another very interesting thing about this particular etching is that it's on Japan paper. Rembrandt loved to experiment. He couldn't keep his hands off the paper, he couldn't keep his hands off the copper plate, he couldn't keep his hands out of the ink. So he would actually go down to the docks and wait for these ships to come in from the Far East. He would buy paper so he could see how the ink would react with the paper. And Japan paper was very rare. The ink stood up off the paper in a different way than it did on Dutch paper or French paper or German paper, which absorbed the ink in a different way than Japan paper. And Japan paper is one of the reasons why it does have this golden glow. Something else Rembrandt did with this plate is he kept altering it. He kept going back and making changes. He changed the chair. He changed the window. He changed the curtains. He changed the hands around. He changed the shading. So this is an extremely early version. It's called a state when he makes a change. This particular plate, as far as we know, went through something like 12 different versions, 12 different states. And this is the fourth state of 12. And we believe it to be, we're pretty certain that we're right, we believe it to be the earliest version of it, the fourth state of 12 in private hands anywhere in the world. And all the rest are in museums, and we know it to be the only fourth state on Japan that's still in private hands. As far as the provenance is concerned, it belonged to the great cataloger, the great art historian Robert-Dumesnil, and the first time we can trace it being sold was in 1836 when it was in a sale in London, and described even then as a superb impression on Indian paper. And so we describe it as a brilliant impression with burr, carefully wiped with tone.
So it has a perfect provenance. May I ask you a very short question about the market? How is the market regarding prints and oil painting, for example?
Well, I'm of course familiar with the market for prints more than I am for paintings, but one difference is that in the painting field, it's very rare that a painting by Rembrandt is going to appear. Now, we're fortunate in this fair that there is one Rembrandt painting that turned up in some small sale in America where nobody knew where it was, and these very intelligent dealers from France spotted it and they bought it. It's just a very tiny one. It's a very pretty little painting. So you cannot really find very many masterpiece, old master paintings. You can find very pleasant paintings, you can find very good paintings. There was a very good painting here in the fair that's been sold to the Maurits House, quite an accomplishment these days to sell a Dutch painting to a great Dutch museum. So it does happen from time to time. In the print and drawing field, great masterpieces, I think we're at the very end of them turning up, but they still have turned up in my career, and they're still turning up. Most of what we get comes from estates and private sources, not out of auction. And so what's represented on these walls, on our Rembrandt wall and on our Dürer wall, is almost all from two different estates. And the market at the top end is very strong. Now, there is a vast market in posthumous reprints of these Rembrandts. They went on being printed for 2 or 3 centuries. In fact, 100 plates of Rembrandt's original plates turned up in some obscure college in North Carolina about 5 or 10 years ago. And there are even impressions from the 19th and 20th century off of those plates. So new collectors need to be very careful about buying posthumous impressions. So this print, for example, this etching by Rembrandt, which is 275,000 euros, I don't mind saying, it's right on our price list. You can find an impression of that, a posthumous impression, damaged condition, posthumous impression, for something like $3,000 or $4,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 euros. So there's a tremendous difference. And that's mostly 99.9% of the Rembrandts that one sees for sale are posthumous late impressions that have little or nothing to do with the artist, in my opinion. And so what a true collector is interested in are the ones that come from the time of Rembrandt. And for that, the market is strong. There are always very fine collectors for that kind of thing. Even in these days of changing tastes, where young people aren't so interested in what we call brown furniture, a lot of antique dealers going out of business, and even some of the old master painting boys having a little bit of trouble. At this end of the print market, even though there are only 2 or 3 dealers left at this end of the old master print market, we have no trouble in finding clients for them. They have to find us. We don't go out to look for them.
Let me ask you a last question about TEFAF. I wanted to ask you about your TEFAF experience, but I think regarding what you just said to me, what do you wear on your jacket?
That's CIA.
Oh.
No, that's a TEFAF pin. And so this is a very early TEFAF pin. And so since I'm a little bit of an antique myself, I continue to wear it. There is a new one that I still have in the box, but I wear this original one. This is our 18th or 19th year doing TEFAF. So I proudly wear the old pin.
Mr. Tunick, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Welcome.